Nature is truly a thing that exists, but staring at a screen and coding a life simulation for 12 hours straight is an even better thing that exists. Today, we're generating infinite worlds with different biomes, plants, and evolutionary chaos for our gooblet friends, because the environment from last video only had bushes and water. It was actually painfully underwhelming and lacked any sense of character, but let's not drag my personality into this. By the end of this video, we're going to have a super interesting world to run a heck ton of simulations on. But the main point of this video is exploring world generation in games, and we're going to look at two methods before we create our very own from scratch, because this whole topic is quite honestly awesome sauce. And hey, if you like my videos, please consider subscribing. Thanks. But where do we begin in making these worlds? Well, we can take inspiration from games like Stardew Valley. While there isn't much procedural generation, every tile is handcrafted and placed with a purpose. This is how we get everything from cliffs to houses to rivers to lifeless conglomerates. These are planned structures that join the world together, but to make it feel more natural, trees randomly spawn around the forest, and same things with shells on the beach and rocks in the mines. These things generate organically and are a nice way to add context and some variety around town. That kind of intuitive logic is something that I want to bring to our gooblet worlds, so that's why I've already brainstormed some ideas of what I want to add. Obviously, I do not want to build every possible world by hand, but I do still want it to feel natural. So let's start by creating a world building robot based on Minecraft's map generation, because this game has probably like dozens of unique worlds at least. But how does it work? At its blocky core is something called a noise map, where each pixel has a value from 0 to 1 depending on its brightness, and that number can be used to generate terrain. It does this by making higher values mountains and lower values oceans. But if we truly used random noise and assigned a random number to every block, we'd end up with this jittery mess. Instead, Minecraft uses Perlin noise, which is still random-ish, but it's smooth random, where pixels kind of blend with its neighbours. This way we get naturally flowing oceans, mountains, and the occasional floating island. All that good stuff for more realistic worlds. Perlin noise is surprisingly sophisticated, so it's also used to decide where biomes go. This makes it so you generally find hot regions of the world next to other hot regions, because it wouldn't quite make sense for a desert to be next to Antarctica. Well, I guess they're both technically deserts, but you know what I mean. Okay, enough procrastinating, I actually need to code something. I was thinking to myself while falling asleep staring at this field of Perlin noise, and this is where I began to see these distinct areas forming. If I draw a line across every dark grey pixel with a value of 0.2 for example, and fill in the area inside it, we have our ocean biome. Next to the water is crunchy, salty, no good tasting sand, and we can make this between 0.2 and 0.3 to make a thin layer of sand surrounding the ocean. We can then make a bigger region for the normal grasslands where the gooblets will be used to living, and everything above 0.75 can be the forest biome. Kabloom, shablam, we're generating biomes, and this already gives us a fair amount of diversity and randomization. Just by nudging the Perlin noise values around, we can generate infinite combinations of these worlds, or if we just update the seed, which is a semi-quasi-random number thing, we can get an entirely new world, which we can then populate with trees, bushes, and goobers. But that's coming up later in the video. Trust me, it's gonna be great, look at how silly they all look here. What I find particularly stellar is that we can create different flavors of worlds by changing these sliders, which represent the proportions of biomes in our map. So we can get huge oceans with tiny islands, or worlds that are just literally forest for the true cellulose enthusiast in all of us. But as much as I love this approach, it does have its issues. One of its biggest downfalls is that everything is stuck in a strict linear order. We're only using a single axis to represent everything, from dark to light, ocean to forest. Let's say I wanted to add a desert biome. Where does it go? It doesn't really make sense for it to be right at the end and always be next to a forest, and it'd be kind of weird to have it be awkwardly sandwiched between grass and beaches. This becomes even more difficult when adding more biomes like tundras, mountains, swamps. Things quickly get out of hand, and this doesn't quite seem to be in the spirit of world generation. So this is where Minecraft pulls a galaxy brain blocky move. Instead of relying on just one Perlin noise map, it stacks two on top of each other, one for temperature and another for rainfall. Suddenly, we've got a 2D space of possibilities, leading to a far more complex world where high temp and low rain equals desert, low temp and moderate rain equals forest, and so on. And this is what our map looks like with this new change. In all honesty, I'm not 100% certain that this visualization is entirely correct. I'm not even like 10% sure of anything that I talk about, ever. But I think this is somewhat close to what I've been yapping about. As you can see, we get more interesting environments than what we had before, and maybe we could stack even more Perlin noise layers on top of this, adding this new dimension of height to get variations like hilly deserts or snowy mountains. We don't even need to use Perlin noise. But Icoso, I hear you scream from the depths of my basement. What other kinds of noises are there, besides the noise of me absolutely going to town on that like and subscribe button? Well, fractal noise uses some crazy equations, which I'm not going to pretend like I understand. It makes less blobby biomes by stacking multiple noise layers on top of each other. And Voronoi noise creates some interesting patterns, like if you're looking at plants or tissues under a microscope, and it creates these visible ridges between cells. So we definitely could be using these types of noise to create unique worlds, but for now, our model has natural enough looking borders and a fair amount of realism, which is great, but the world does feel very samey, and I don't like repetition. You get smooth looking biomes, sure, but no real surprises. And more importantly, this approach is not silly. In fact, there are tons of ways to generate worlds, and none of them are wrong, but this video is all about experimenting with different methods. So now that I've successfully and unwillingly humbled myself by misunderstanding these noise functions, we're going to explore the magical world of wave function collapse, harnessing the power of quantum physics. Calling this method quantum physics adjacent may very well be a stretch, but wave function collapse is truly a fascinating system. It's used in a variety of games like Bad North and Isle Goblin to dynamically build worlds. So here's a quick rundown of how it works. We've got 4 biome types, but each tile in our map is initially undecided. Any tile here could become any one of these 4 biomes, but just like me, they don't know where to go in life. So to get the ball rolling, we'll take the center tile of our map grid and turn it to grass. Now, we can update the 4 surrounding tiles by what biomes they could become based on the rules of the grass biome. Here, our predefined rule set determines that grass biomes can be next to grass, sand, or forest tiles, but not water. Instead of 4 choices now, these tiles only have 3. This means that these tiles have a lower entropy, which is where quantum physics comes in, but Professor Goober will explain that to you in the briefest of seconds, don't you worry. So next, one of these tiles will randomly become one of its available biomes. In this case, it just so happens to randomly select sand. Now we do the same thing as before, we update all the neighbouring tiles to narrow down their possibilities based on the biome's rules. I made it so sand tiles can't be next to forests, but they do allow for the generation of water. So we do this over and over again, and after enough iterations of our algorithm, we get our complete world. And if you were watching particularly carefully, you might have noticed that the wave function collapse has an interesting quirk, where before choosing a tile to collapse into its biome, it'll only consider the tiles with the lowest entropy. In other words, the algorithm only considers tiles with the fewest possible choices as the next candidate to be collapsed. To better visualize this, let's take an example of a 3x3 grid with 2 remaining tiles. This one at the bottom right could be grass or sand, but the tile at the top left could be grass, sand, or forest. The algorithm will actually choose to collapse the first tile before the other one, as it had the fewest remaining possibilities, because I think 2 is less than 3, but someone please fact check me on that. Quick-ish side tangent, hosted by Professor Goober. He has a PhD in silliness and his diet only consists of baguettes. So what is entropy? Well, for each tile in our world generation algorithm, it relates to the number of ways it can be arranged, or how many things can happen. Higher entropy means more uncertainty or disorder. In other words, how many ways could have we gotten to or potentially get to state B from state A, based on even the smallest microscopic events. But take this with a really big grain of salt. Literally, NaCl, NaCl, the magical rock that makes vegetables actually taste like food. As a solid, its atoms are fixed in place, so it's very orderly, making it have low entropy. But drop this salt cube in a glass of water, and suddenly we've introduced tons of H2O molecules to the system. It becomes chaotic with sodium atoms floating over here, chloride drifting over there, and water molecules jiggling uncontrollably. So even though from the outside we have a seemingly chill mixture of dissolved salt in water, the total entropy of this system has actually increased because there are just so many ways that these molecules can be arranged. Alright, sorry, that was a lot for a silly YouTube video. We can even get situations where we only have one choice for a given tile, based on how the surrounding tiles generated. The only common tile that can spawn next to grass, sand, and forest is grass, so that's the only option we have here. If you were particularly observant, you might have noticed this happening at 2 different points in our 5x5 grid from before, and this isn't an issue for our algorithm or anything, but I thought it was interesting. Now, between the pixel puzzles, quantum confuzzles, entropy struggles, and tiling troubles, this process was pretty confusing for me to get my head around. So I hope this crudely made flowchart can help you understand it a bit better. And to me, flowcharts help a lot because making evolution simulators and procedurally generated worlds are big projects, but something that's just as complex and important is actually project management. Whether you're building a game, running a studio, or just trying to keep your team afloat, you need a system that works for you, and that's where Odoo comes in. Odoo is an all-in-one business management platform that helps you stay organized without drowning in spreadsheets or juggling 5 different tools. Their project app is especially powerful. It's like world generation for your workflow. You can create new projects at the click of a button and set up schedules and timelines to keep you on track, all from a single dashboard. Then you can create tasks and subtasks within which you can schedule activities like focus periods, calls, meetings, or reminders. It's super flexible and intuitive. Trust me, you won't be needing a degree in spreadsheet sorcery. Odoo Project also comes with a bunch of great ways to organize your work. Use Kanban View to drag tasks like sticky notes across stages, Gantt View to visualize timelines and dependencies, or List View for batch edits and clean organization. And if you're working in a team, you can easily invite your mates. Collaboration is seamless. You can tag team members, attach files, leave notes, and send emails directly from the task. It's like having a centralized command center for your entire project. And the best part is that your first Odoo app is free for life, with unlimited hosting and support. So whether you're managing a solo dev project or coordinating a full team of wannabe scientists, Odoo is the tool for you. Check out the link below to give it a try, and thank you to Odoo for supporting today's silly video. But while researching for this video, this did make me wonder, why do we even need to follow the steps of choosing the tiles with the lowest entropy first? Sure, it makes it look fancy and it's interesting to talk about, but I think I maybe understand why we're doing this. It's to avoid contradictions like this in the future. We can't place a grass tile because then it'll be next to water, but if we choose a sand tile, then it's next to a forest. We literally don't have any choice, and the reason this would have occurred is because we didn't follow the lowest entropy rule earlier in the generation. It might seem okay at the time when placing tiles, but it'll eventually come back to chomp you, and this leads to illegal map configurations. But so far, this is pretty simple using only 4 biome types. So just like before, we're going to add new biomes to this world generation, but we're going to move out of my editing software and instead into a game engine where I don't have to animate everything by hand. And I gotta say, this looks kind of redonkulous. Even though the tiles do follow the rules correctly, it's way too messy and looks like a gooblet just goobed all over the place. And we don't get those natural terrain features like we want to see, so how do we get this jumbled mess into something a little bit more organized? If we're trying to choose what goes next to a grass biome, for example, we can tell the algorithm that instead of choosing from any valid tiles, there should be a bigger chance for some biomes to be selected over other ones. This is called tile weighting, and it gives us a bit more control over what our world looks like based on context. So if we want bigger forests, we can simply increase the chance for forest tiles to spawn next to each other. Nudging these values around makes the world feel more natural and much less caffeinated than what we had before, and again gives us unique flavors every time we run the simulation. I even went one step further to make it so that the more of a single biome type is surrounding another, the more likely it is to turn into that same tile type. This makes it so we get bigger blobs that aren't just dotted around the place, but makes it feel like an actual region that belongs in the world, like realistic biomes. I like how the deep ocean tiles kind of surround and envelops the entire map to make it look like these bigger islands. And look, watching this generate in real time after programming it is such a cool experience. I feel like a proud childless father. I'm always surprised by how lines of code and simple rule sets leads to these stunning results. I want to say I spent about 7 hours just pressing the reset button here. It's really satisfying. We could even go further and introduce unique tile types with different shapes and sizes, like a 2x2 volcano biome or a star-shaped gooblet monument. What I would really love to do though, if the community yearns for it, is create a kind of self-building city game using wave function collapse. I think it'd be really fun to have roads and trees and houses generate and then have cars and silly guys pathfinding around town, each with their own names and interests and jobs and relationships and yeah, I'm probably getting ahead of myself. Anyway, I was also mesmerized by this other experiment I did using solid colors, and the shape that it forms kind of reminds me of a ravine or canyon if these different colors related to the height of the ground. Although it looks pretty different from our previous model, I'm really happy with the outcome of this little experiment. And honestly, I love squares. I even named one of my albums after the quintessential quadrilateral, but this map is one step too far. It has too many sharp edges and I am simply not an edgelord. I do love the visual hand-drawn gooblet aesthetic, and I want to bring that into their world. So my friends, we arrive at the superior method of world generation, hexagons. They are, in fact, the bestagons, and they'll finally allow us to run experiments and bust out the greatly groovy graphs once again. The default tile is our simple grasslands like normal, and they each have a 60% chance to have a bush on it. Berries regrow on these bushes over time, but after enough gooblets eat from them, the bush will perish and they'll respawn somewhere nearby. Grass tiles also have a 10% chance to have an oak tree, but we'll get to that later. Just like before, certain tiles aren't allowed to generate next to each other, except now we have 6 different connections rather than 4. Forests take advantage of this because whenever one forest tile spawns, it increases the likelihood of surrounding tiles to spawn forests as well, which is how we get these biomes spreading out naturally. A similar thing happens with water tiles to create ponds of different shapes and sizes, but obviously not as big as forests. I tried to balance these biomes as best I could so the gooblets had enough water sources to drink from, but not so much water that it takes up everything else in the world or doesn't incentivize gooblets to actually evolve. And the footage you're seeing here is a little behind the scenes, because you can see that the tiles are placed first before adding decorations and plants and borders and things like that. These borders are actually 6 separate sprites to help with that hand-drawn aesthetic I was going on about earlier. You might also notice that there's a somewhat janky coordinate system for these tiles when they generate, because they aren't quite as easy to keep track of as the square grid, but I digress. A lot, clearly. So next are desert and tundra biomes, and I wanted to use some different logic here so they wouldn't look exactly like our forests. Instead of chaining together, it'll generate a desert center tile, which then spreads out in all directions to make a more circular looking biome. I can adjust the radius that this extends out to, and to make it feel a bit more organic, the tiles on the outer edge have a chance of transforming back into normal grass, just so we don't have the exact same shape for each desert and it blends in a bit better with surrounding grass tiles. The center tile finally gets transformed back into water, so gooblets actually have a way of surviving in these habitats. I use this method for tundras as well, since these biomes are on opposite ends of the temperature spectrum, so they're not going to be spawning too close to one another. These areas also put negative effects on any gooblets who are standing on them. In the deserts, the intense heat makes the gooblets more thirsty for water. The tundra makes the gooblets move slower through the snow, and they also get hungry and thirsty moderately more quickly than usual, since they need more energy to keep their body warm. The forest biome also has some negative effects, because since there are so many trees, I thought it'd make sense for the sight range of gooblets to be decreased, and also move a little slower to navigate this crowded environment. To begin with, I generated a pretty evenly distributed world, and threw a bunch of gooblets in there for them to live and evolve. Over some time, the total gooblet population grew from an initial 50 to 700, with some crazy wave-like patterns after this, which was pretty interesting to see. Move speed and sight range get better at a relatively stable rate, and that's fantastic, whatever, we've all seen the last video, we've already seen these stats before. Instead, I decided to measure the biomes that the gooblets died in, so basically finding which tiles had the greatest death rates, and after a handful of tests, most gooblets were dying on the grass biomes. This was very strange and confusing, and I thought that the deserts and tundras were going to be the most deadly, because these had the most severe impacts on the gooblets. Even forests had higher death rates than deserts, and these 3 biomes don't even have anything for gooblets to eat, so why aren't more of them dying in these environments? And this is where, for the first time in my life, my neurons boinked together and I realized what was going on. You see, in our original simulation, if gooblets had enough food and water and they didn't run out of them, they could essentially live forever. But at the start of working on this video, I quickly added a few lines of code to track the gooblet's age, so after it lives for long enough, it'll die no matter what. This was to help our population numbers not to get too out of control, but this also meant that there were more gooblets living peacefully in the grass biome. These gooblets would still die eventually, not because the environment was tough to survive in, but just because they got old. They reached unk status. Plus, most of the world here is just grass, so it makes sense that we have more gooblets on grass and they die here. So what we need to do now is track the cause of death for each biome. Every time a gooblet dies, info is sent to our simulation manager, which collects data on where and how they died. By splitting up the causes of death for each biome, we can easily see that the biggest proportion of gooblets on grass tiles did die from old age, so they had great lives in the grass biome, but the same can't be said for deserts, tundras, or even forests, where there are much higher death rates for hunger and thirst. It makes sense that there were more thirst-related deaths in the deserts, since the negative effects of the desert tiles only impacts the gooblet's thirst, whereas the tundra biome hits hunger and thirst equally. That being said though, we do still get a pretty significant proportion of gooblets dying from hunger, which indicates that we probably need more food sources in our world. I also want to make these deadly environments slightly less deadly, and one of the main reasons for their deadliness at the moment is that I actually haven't added any food sources in these biomes. Cacti seem like a reasonable choice for the deserts, acting pretty similar to the bush in that it can grow up to 3 items of food at once, except this time it's cactus fruit. But of course it's never as simple as that. Cactuses, cacti, cactopodes, whatever you want to call them, they are spiky. So whenever gooblets try to harvest the fruit, they have a pretty big chance of getting poked and straight up perishing on contact. As a result, it's pretty dangerous to eat in the desert, so this is where we can introduce a new intelligence trait to our gooblets. This ranges from low to high, where smarter gooblets have a better chance of not dying when harvesting cactus fruit. I assume they just have a better knowledge of how to safely remove the fruit without getting prickled to death. But I also want to apply this intelligence trait to gooblets in the tundra, so we have to make a new food type for it as well. Colder landscapes usually have smaller, shrubbier foods, but can you tell these two plants apart? If you can, you might not be a gooblet, or you're a smart gooblet, because gooblets are rather silly, and they aren't great at differentiating between these two plants. Besides looking like an exotic sea urchin dish from an Italian-Japanese fusion restaurant in the back alleys of suburban California, these plants do have slightly different functions. Cinderleaf results from a random genetic mutation of munchleaf with a 10% chance to occur. They both act as small food sources for the gooblets, they don't give that much increase to hunger, but Cinderleaf gives a temporary boost of warmth, counteracting the coldness of tundra tiles. Similar to the prickly cacti, will give a slight advantage to gooblets with more intelligence, since it makes sense that they'll be better at selecting the Cinderleaf rather than the munchleaf. Like with other traits that the gooblets have, intelligence is passed down from generation to generation, with each goobling being a mixture of their parents. So a smart gooblet and a not so smart gooblet will produce a pretty mid-child. This way, through natural selection and evolution, we find that the average intelligence of the species trends upwards over time, because smarter gooblets have a better chance of eating food, surviving, producing offspring, and sending their smart genes onto their goobling children. Now, it's not surprising that the intelligence trait increases, because it directly relates to better survival. But at the same time as this simulation, I've again been keeping data on how each gooblet died from our now 4 possible causes of death. When we consider the effects of greater intelligence on gooblets, I thought that we'd have less gooblets dying from cacti and more from old age, which is exactly what happened. At the beginning of our simulation, our gooblets were still exploring their world, and there were quite a few deaths from thirst and cactus prickles, so I guess they were dying more on desert tiles. This is because at this point in their evolution, they had relatively low move speed, sight range, and intelligence traits, before they had the chance to properly adapt to their new world. A bit later on, we see fewer gooblet deaths related to cacti, and instead more from old age, and this is happening at the same time as the rise in gooblet intelligence. This also aligns with fewer gooblets dying from hunger and thirst, and I think it's most likely because gooblets were eating more cinderleaf than munchleaf in the tundra. Like I mentioned before, cinderleaf has warming properties which allows gooblets to live more easily in the cold regions of the world, so there's less chance of them to die from hunger or thirst, and instead they live on to eventually die from old age. And as our simulation continued, the gooblets had evolved enough to live comfortably in their new environment, and we can really see this old age breakaway. The new food types definitely helped here, as there were so few deaths related to hunger. If we put back the intelligence of the gooblets that we were just looking at before, we can link this better lifespan with gooblets becoming smarter. Getting all this data was surprisingly fun. Yes, it was a lot of numbers, but it makes me feel like I'm not a 20-year-old loser. I mean, just look at my scientific rigor with my silly little simulation that I coded. I got 53 years of programming expertise, a love for academic research, and beautiful graphs. For whatever reason, if some researchers are watching this video, please hire me. I want a job in a neuroscience lab. Please just give me anything at all to do. I'll get coffees for the team. I just want to be included and do brain scans. Please notice me. I don't have any qualifications, but like, come on, it'd be really cool. So that was a pretty in-depth experiment, so I want to take a step away and talk about the decorations that are spread out across the world. It's time for another quick side tangent, hosted by Goubert, the famous French art curator. There are heaps of small details around our hexagonal world, and we haven't mentioned them yet because they don't contribute much to our species' survival, but they do make the world feel more alive, connected, and gives it a bit of personality. They aren't just placed randomly though. Things like rocks, for example, generate closer to biome borders, and bushes will never spawn on tiles next to water. Sprites also randomly change size a bit, or they can be flipped along the vertical axis as a sneakily easy way to avoid repetition when we have lots of these sprites near each other. We get so many different possible combinations of trees and rocks and mushrooms and whatever else to make it feel a bit more natural, and it's helped by some subtle animations like tree leaves rotating back and forth and these particle effects in the water for some movement. All of these things are actually quite common in game development, so see if you can spot them when playing your next game. There are probably more details tucked away in Icoso's stupid code which he forgot to talk about, but these small things do a lot for our world. Wombos, our favourite, the natural predator of the gooblets, who chase them down and reproduce when they've eaten enough of them. Throwing these gorging gooblet gobbling gluttons into the world, we can already see that the Wombo nation leads to devastation on the gooblet population as they make up a large formation of their extermination throughout the simulation. Straight buzz. We can see this by looking at the number of gooblets and wombos over time, and if you're wondering why this region is flat, it's because I simply had to limit the maximum number of gooblets. My PC really wasn't having it that day. But yeah, the wombo population grew too close to the sun, so they ate too many gooblets, there weren't enough of them to go around, and so the wombos started to die off as well. However, wombos are very chunky, so I'll make it that when they are in the forest biome, they move extremely slowly because they are just so big, and this allows gooblets to kind of hide in these regions. We didn't have too much going on in the forest before this, so I think it balances it out with the desert and tundra biomes by having this unique feature. To test these effects, I ran 2 simulations in a grassy and foresty environment. In the grass world, we had a really similar result as before, where most gooblets died from being eaten by wombos. But in the forest world, the causes of death became a lot more even, which was great to see, because 1, this means my code actually worked, and 2, gooblets found the forest biomes a lot safer than the grass, so they were able to survive better here. We can again consider the total number of wombos and gooblets in our world. Since the grass made it easier for wombos to find gooblets, eat them, and reproduce, we get a lot more wombos here than in the forest. In fact, we only reached a maximum of 16 wombos in the forest compared to 72 in the grassland, but the ones here did eat their way to extinction when they gobbled up all the goobers. Another interesting point to look at is quote-unquote migration patterns in gooblets, and what I mean by that is simply looking at where they tend to move around the world, or rather, where in the world gooblets tend to go to have the best chance of survival. It makes sense that there are more of them wherever there's more food and water, but on the other end of this we see far less gooblets chilling in the harsher areas of the world. I didn't do any, testing or statistical analysis for this, but I thought it was a pretty interesting result, since I didn't design the gooblets to intentionally migrate, so it's cool that it was just something that happened. Oh, and I hope you enjoyed this video of me here failing to use the camera controller, which I made specifically for recording these clips. To go one step further, I made an artificial world that was half desert and half tundra to see what the gooblets would prefer, but they didn't really seem to have a preference for either biome. Both sides of the world had similar number of gooblets at any given time, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because we did the same experiment in the last video, but the gooblets actually preferred the warmer environment. But I guess these are 2 different temperature systems, so we can't be too surprised. I want to see how much the intelligence of gooblets can be affected by their world. For the first test, I'll use this desert tundra world, and we've already talked about how cacti and munchleaf equal greater intelligence for gooblets. So when we run this simulation for long enough, newer generations of gooblets do become smarter as we would expect. Grand. For the second test, I used the exact same starting conditions, except the world now was entirely grass or forest tiles. These biomes don't have any features that concern intelligence, so after we run the simulation for long enough, the intelligence does move around a bit just due to random number generators, but the curve is relatively flat, and it indicates that the environment didn't affect the gooblets' intelligence. They simply don't care about becoming smarter, so it makes sense that there won't be any significant changes since they don't need intelligence to survive. I can certainly relate. Another test I ran was putting some poorly developed gooblets at the bottom of the world here with the basics, food and water. I wanted to see if they could evolve enough to escape to the other side of this massive forest. As a quick reminder, forest tiles are pretty tough since they reduce the move speed and sight range to a pretty considerable extent, so gooblets need to be strong enough before they even considered traversing this massive forest. It did take a few attempts and hundreds of sacrificed gooblets to the evolutionary woes of the woodlands, but eventually we did get gooblets crossing to the other side. And then weirdly, none of them actually went back to where they started. So... Now, as much as I pretend that I'm proud of myself for the progress that I made as a facade for my growing imposter syndrome, I still think the environment could be improved. For example, I feel like we could do more with the forest biome. So what if gooblets here had a chance of getting infected and becoming a disease carrier? Maybe the mushrooms could act as a medicine for gooblets if they're intelligent enough to eat them. And I think the mushrooms actually have a lot of potential here, maybe acting as a food source for the forest, but others are poisonous. Or perhaps the mushrooms could simply have other effects. Another thing that I planned but actually turned my neurons into a steaming pile of linguini was the evolution of plants around the world. Things like how fast they grew, how many berries they could hold, how quickly they spread, things like that. Also, I think gooblets shaking trees to get food from them could be really fun. I even planned a new strength trait for this, which maybe has the drawback of them needing to eat more food. Or we could introduce an athleticism trait for gooblets to parkour up into the tree to get the food instead. And I wonder which one of these two traits would prove victorious. Victorious. Synonym of awesome sauce. Which is what this project has been. So thank you very much for sitting through yet another one of my incoherent ramblings. I had a lot of fun with this video, I hope you enjoyed it, or that you learnt something new, or that you already knew everything that I said. As always, I appreciate every comment and interaction, and I wonder if I've used up my time for the outro. My credit card number is 420.